1974, Hamburg, Germany. In the red light district of St. Pauli, life is cheap and the air is thick with the scent of cheap schnapps and cigarettes. In a cramped, attic apartment on Zeißstraße, a man with a crooked nose and thick glasses sits alone. His name is Fritz Honka. He is a social outcast, a man who spends his nights in a dive bar called the Golden Glove, looking for women as broken as he is. But Fritz has a secret hidden behind the paneling of his walls. For years, women have been entering his apartment and never coming out. The neighbors complain about the stench, but Fritz has a simple explanation. He says it's the Greek families cooking downstairs. They believe him. Welcome to the Well of Monsters. Fritz Honka was born in 1935 in Leipzig, a city that would soon be torn apart by World War II. His childhood was a blueprint for disaster. His father was a communist who was sent to a concentration camp, and Fritz grew up in a series of harsh state orphanages. He was a small, frail boy, frequently bullied and physically abused. These early years stripped him of his empathy and replaced it with a deep-seated resentment toward a world that had rejected him from birth. In the 1950s, a horrific car accident left Fritz with a severely broken nose and a permanent squint. These physical deformities made him even more of a social pariah. He moved to Hamburg, seeking a fresh start, but he only found labor jobs and the bottom of a bottle. He was a man who couldn't communicate with women under normal circumstances. He felt inferior, mocked, and ignored. This frustration was a pressure cooker, waiting for a catalyst to explode into violence. To understand Fritz Honka, you must understand the Golden Glove. This was a 24-hour dive bar in the heart of St. Pauli, a sanctuary for the forgotten. It was filled with aging women, alcoholics, and the homeless. Here, Fritz felt like an equal. He spent every night in the same booth, drinking corn brandy and looking for women who were desperate enough to accept an invitation from a man like him. The women he targeted were usually older, struggling with severe alcoholism, and had no family left to look for them. Fritz would offer them a place to sleep and more drink, and in their desperation, they would follow him back to his attic apartment. He was looking for someone he could control, someone who couldn't laugh at his face or walk away from his demands. In 1970, the first shadow fell over Fritz's attic. A woman named Gertrud Bräuer, a regular at the Golden Glove, went home with Fritz. She was 42 years old and had lived a hard life. When she refused to be intimate with him, Fritz's repressed rage finally shattered. Fritz didn't just kill her, he acted with a sudden, overwhelming brutality that surprised even him. But once the act was done, he was faced with a logistical problem: how to dispose of a body in a crowded apartment building. Fritz was not a criminal mastermind. He was a panicked laborer. He tried to move the body, but he was too weak. He decided to do the only thing he knew how to do with tools. He began to dismantle the remains. He hid parts of Gertrude in the alcoves and crawl spaces behind the walls of his attic, covered them in sawdust and pine-scented air fresheners, and went back to the Golden Glove the next night. He had found that the world didn't miss Gertrud Bräuer, and that realization made him feel powerful for the first time in his life. The apartment on Zeißstraße was tiny, less than 20 square meters. It was a sloping attic room with low ceilings and stained wallpaper. Yet this was the place where Fritz lived, ate, and slept alongside his victims. As the months passed, he killed again. Anna Boy's Hell, Frieda Roblick, and Ruth Schult followed the same path. They were lured with the promise of warmth and alcohol, only to meet their end in the claustrophobic darkness of the attic. Fritz became a meticulous hider. He would wrap the remains in plastic and shove them into the dead spaces created by the roof's angles. He lived in a literal tomb. To mask the growing smell of decay, he bought hundreds of pine-scented car air fresheners, hanging them from the ceiling like grotesque ornaments. He became accustomed to the stench, his senses dulled by years of heavy drinking and the proximity of death. He was a man living in a nightmare of his own making, yet he functioned as a normal citizen by day. The neighbors in the building began to notice the smell almost immediately. It was a thick, cloying scent that seeped through the floorboards and into the hallways. They complained to the landlord and to Fritz himself. Fritz, with his squinted eyes and crooked nose, would simply shrug and blame the Greek family on the ground floor, claiming their exotic cooking was rotting in the pipes. Because the building was in a poor district and the tenants were mostly marginalized people, the authorities never bothered to investigate further. This overlooked trail of death is the most tragic part of the Honka story. For 5 years, the remains of 4 women sat just inches away from where people lived their daily lives. The police occasionally visited the area for bar fights or petty thefts, but they never stepped into the attic. Fritz was a nobody, and in the eyes of the Hamburg authorities in the 70s, the disappearances of older, alcoholic prostitutes weren't a priority. Fritz was protected by the world's indifference. The end of Fritz Honka's reign came from a mechanical failure. On July 15, 1975, while Fritz was at work as a night watchman, a fire broke out in the building on Zeißstraße. The fire was caused by a neighbor's stove, but the smoke spread through the entire structure. Firefighters rushed to the scene, breaking down doors to ensure no one was trapped in the upper floors. When a firefighter entered Honka's attic, he was nearly knocked unconscious, not by the smoke but by the smell. Looking for the source of what he thought was a burst sewage pipe or a dead animal, he moved a piece of furniture and saw a human hand protruding from a gap in the wall. The firefighters called the police, and as the investigators began to tear down the paneling, they realized they hadn't just found a fire victim. They had found a human graveyard in a space the size of a closet. Fritz Honka was arrested later that night as he returned from his shift. The police found him in a nearby bar, predictably drunk. When they told him they had been in his attic, he looked at them with a strange sense of relief and said, "I knew you would come eventually." He was taken to the police station where he was given coffee to sober him up. In his confession, he spoke about the women from the Golden Glove as if they were chores he had to finish. He admitted to the 4 murders, describing how he had used a saw to fit them into the walls. The police were horrified by his lack of emotion. To Fritz, these women weren't victims, they were burdens that he didn't know how to get rid of. The man with the crooked nose had finally been unmasked, and Hamburg realized that a monster had been drinking in their bars for years. The German tabloids went into a frenzy. They dubbed Fritz Honka the Ripper of St. Pauli. The public was obsessed with the details of the attic, the smell, the pine trees, and the smallness of the room. Photos of the Golden Glove were splashed across every newspaper. The bar, ironically, became even more famous, with people visiting just to see where Fritz had sat. The media focused on Honka's appearance, using his deformities to portray him as a subhuman beast. This sensationalism masked a deeper failure, the fact that Honka had been a suspect in a previous assault case years earlier but had been let go. The public wanted a monster to hate, but they didn't want to look at the societal conditions of St. Pauli that had allowed a man like Honka to thrive in the first place. The trial of Fritz Honka began in 1976. The courtroom was packed with journalists and curious locals. The prosecution focused on the brutality of the dismemberment, while the defense argued that Honka was a man of limited intelligence and diminished responsibility due to his severe alcoholism and traumatic childhood. Fritz sat in the dock, often appearing confused or uninterested in the proceedings. Many of the women had no one to speak for them. They had lived lives of total isolation. The trial revealed that Honka hadn't targeted these women because they were easy to kill, but because they were easy to forget. The court had to acknowledge that the overlooked trail of death was a result of a society that turned its back on the residents of the Reeperbahn. In a verdict that surprised many, Fritz Honka was not sentenced to life in a standard prison. The court accepted the psychiatric evaluation that he was mentally unstable and suffered from brain damage caused by long-term alcohol abuse and his earlier accident. He was found guilty of murder but was sentenced to life in a high-security psychiatric hospital. Fritz was being sent to a place where he would be fed, clothed, and treated, a luxury his victims never had. To the public, it felt like the monster of St. Pauli was being shielded from the true weight of his crimes. But for Fritz, the hospital was the first stable home he had ever known. Fritz Honka spent the next 15 years in the Oxensol Psychiatric Hospital. He was a quiet, unassuming inmate. He became a shadow once again, just as he had been in the Golden Glove. The nurses and guards described him as a polite little man who liked to smoke and watch television. In his rare sessions with therapists, he maintained that the women had driven him to it by mocking him or refusing his advances. He lived in a state of perpetual self-victimization, unable to grasp the magnitude of the horror he had inflicted. The man who had lived with rotting remains in his walls was now living in a clean, clinical environment, a final irony in a life of squalor. In 1993, after nearly 2 decades in the hospital, Fritz Honka was released. The German legal system believed he was no longer a threat due to his age and failing health. However, because of his infamy, he could not return to Hamburg as Fritz Honka. He was given a new identity. He was moved to a nursing home in the city of Langenhorn. He lived his final years as an anonymous pensioner. He would sit in the common room, a frail old man with a crooked nose, and no one knew that he had once been the most feared man in Germany. He took his secrets and his real name to the grave. He died in 1998 at the age of 63. The man who had spent his life trying to be seen had finally achieved total anonymity. Fritz Honka wasn't a genius, he was a symptom of a world that didn't care. He proved that a monster doesn't need a castle, he only needs a small attic and a society that refuses to look up. Subscribe, ring the bell, and thanks for watching. Don't forget, I'll see you at the bottom of the well.